It's a clash of titans, world champion Magnus Carlsen versus the speed chess king Hikaru Nakamura in a high-stakes battle at the Croatia Grand Chess Tour. Let's dive in. The game opens with a classic Queen's Gambit declined. Both players develop their pieces with textbook precision, building a solid foundation for the complex middle game to come. Magnus opts for the popular bishop to f4 setup, putting early pressure on Black's camp. Hikaru responds by challenging the center with pawn to c5, and the maneuvering begins. The pressure continues to build. Carlsen centralizes his queen and rooks, creating a powerful battery aimed at the heart of Black's position, while Nakamura prepares to contest the open files. And the game explodes. After some preparatory moves, Magnus pushes his pawn to e4, seizing space. Hikaru immediately fires back with pawn to e5, and the central tension is at a boiling point. Carlsen plays the calm but potent bishop to e3, tucking the piece away and preparing for the coming tactical storm. And here comes Hikaru, a brilliant sacrifice knight to d4. The point is to deflect White's bishop, allowing Black's rook to crash in on c4 and win a pawn. Carlsen accepts the challenge, taking the knight on d4, and Nakamura follows through with his rook snapping off the bishop on c4. The plan is a success. The tactics continue to fly. White captures the e5 pawn, Black pins with bishop to a4, and Magnus immediately challenges it with pawn to b3. A dizzying sequence. But here, Nakamura slips, taking the pawn on e4. This is an inaccuracy as it allows White a powerful response in queen to e2, which would have won material. Magnus misses his chance, instead playing the solid rook to d3, improving his position but letting Black off the hook. Nakamura plays his rook back, but this is another slip that hands the initiative to White. The engine preferred a more active defense. The stronger try was bishop to f6, and after bishop takes bishop on f6, pawn recaptures on f6. And then, if pawn takes the bishop on a4, the rook takes the knight on c3, keeping the balance. But in the game, Hikaru simply plays rook to c8, and the position swings in White's favor. Carlsen improves his queen's position, sliding it over to b2 to eye Black's weaknesses. And that is a serious mistake. Knight to c5 from Nakamura is an inaccuracy that gives Carlsen a winning advantage. The devastating reply is rook to e3, launching a powerful attack, and Magnus finds it. Rook to e3 hits the board, and White's attack is in full swing. A fantastic resource from Nakamura. Bishop takes the pawn on b3 is the only move that keeps him in the game, creating counter-threats and muddying the waters. But Carlsen is relentless. He ignores the threat and smashes through with bishop takes the pawn on g7, ripping open the cover around the Black king. Nakamura defends with rook to g4, but this is an inaccuracy. The stronger defense was queen to d8, coordinating his pieces much more effectively. Carlsen continues his attack, but this move lets some of the advantage slip. He had a more clinical path to victory. The killer blow was bishop to d4. After queen to d8, White plays bishop takes the knight on c5. Black recaptures with the bishop on c5, and knight to e4 wins the piece and the game. Instead, in the game, Magnus plays bishop takes the pawn on h6, keeping the pressure on but giving Black a glimmer of hope. And Hikaru finds a solid defensive move, bishop to f6, reinforcing his king's shaky position. Brilliant. Magnus uncorks knight to e5, a stunning sacrifice that completely shatters Black's defensive setup. The idea is to eliminate the key defender and open up fatal attacking lines. Nakamura has no choice, he must accept the sacrifice, and the bishop takes the knight on e5, and the follow-up is perfect. Rook takes the bishop on e5 is the only move to keep the attack raging, bringing the rook into the assault on the exposed Black king. The queens shift positions with Nakamura's queen moving to b6 to create counter-threats, while Carlsen's queen to d2 prepares the final wave of the attack. A slip from Hikaru. Rook to g6 looks active, but it further weakens his king. The more resilient defense was queen to f6. Carlsen calmly improves, bringing his bishop to e3, adding another piece to the ever-growing attack. And another inaccuracy from Black with queen to c6. This allows White to shut down all counterplay with the simple crushing move, pawn to f3. But Magnus misses it. He's still completely winning, but he overlooks the most precise move. The killer was pawn to f3. If knight to e6, knight to d5 follows. Bishop takes the knight on d5, and rook takes the bishop on d5. And it's all over. Back in the game, Carlsen plays knight to d5, a strong move, but not the most decisive. A flurry of exchanges follows as the bishop takes the knight on d5 and the queen recaptures. The tactical storm is finally clearing, leaving Magnus with a winning advantage, and now the queens come off the board. The players trade on c6, and we enter a rook endgame where Carlsen is up a pawn with a clear path to victory. Nakamura plays his knight back to a passive square, making the conversion much easier for white. He had a more stubborn way to defend. The better try was knight to f6. After rook to g5 check, the king steps to f8, then pawn to h4 and rook to d6, offering much more resistance. But instead, Hikaru chose knight to f8, and white's task is simplified. And now we see the world champion's flawless technique. Rook to d1, knight to e6, and pawn to a4, Magnus systematically improves his position. That's a mistake. Nakamura's rook to c4 misplaces the piece and allows white's a-pawn to become a monster. He needed to play rook to b8. Then, after pawn to a5, pawn takes on a5, rook takes the pawn on a7, and rook to a8 keeps black in the fight. But with the move played, rook to c4, the game is slipping away. Carlsen executes the winning plan perfectly. The a-pawn marches forward, forcing favorable exchanges, and ultimately his rook scoops up the pawn on a7. Nakamura tries to create some counterplay with his own passed pawn, but it's easily contained by Carlsen's dominant rooks, which shut down any hope. And that is the final decisive mistake. Knight to e6 allows white to consolidate completely, and the position becomes hopeless. The last chance was rook to c4, after king to g2, knight to c6, rook to a6, and pawn to f6. Black can fight on. But after the move played, knight to e6, the writing is on the wall. Magnus makes the final tidying up moves, bringing his rook to a5 and his king to g2. With no counterplay and down material, Nakamura's position is completely lost, and with that, Hikaru Nakamura resigns. White wins, a thrilling and complex victory for Magnus Carlsen. Here's a look at why the position was hopeless. If black tries rook to cn, white's rook takes the pawn on a4. After rook takes rook on a4, rook takes back on a4, and if pawn to f5, white's passed pawn is unstoppable.